This is a production of Cornell University.
Thank you, Tony, for that nice introduction, and thank you again for the opportunity to come and talk today. As Tony said, this has kind of been something that's been ruminating, at least for me, for longer than I've known Tony. This is actually like a 5-year going on longer type of thing. So I don't want to dive into too much of that right now because that's part of my presentation, but just again, I want to thank you for this chance to talk to you. And like Tony said, we're really looking for feedback. So even if you don't have something now, today, you think something, we'd be happy to hear from you. So I'll go ahead and get started here. And I just want to just give a little outline of what I'm going to talk about today so you can kind of follow me through this. And this is for the presentation. I'm going to give a little background. And, and before just jumping right into this, I thought it'd be helpful if I told you how I got to where I am with this and how we got to thinking about this, or at least how I did. So I'm going to talk about thought process, my thought process, because for those of you who are in graduate school right now, you're having all kinds of thoughts, or maybe you're having no thoughts. But at some point, if you stay in this business long enough, you're going to put those thoughts together, and this could be a way to kind of see that process. So, and I'll talk about some time points as we go along, and then we'll hit the key research papers that kind of where I found really underpin this framework that I'm going to present to you. Developing the framework, looking at our conceptual models, testing the models, and then talking about how that relates to future directions with this framework. And again, when I get to this part, this is really a collaborative effort between Tony and another faculty member at Trinity Western University, David Clements. And so those two guys have been helpful in this process too. So first of all, the thought process. So thinking broadly thinking, okay, that's kind of an oxymoron, but you just kind of ruminate on that. And really, when we talk about thought processes, there's one of two ways, and I realize I'm probably maybe categorizing them too narrowly, but I'm just going to talk about, there's the reduction approach, and that's looking at the idea of reducing complex interactions and entities to the sum of their constituent parts in order to make them easier to study. So we break things down. You might work at the cellular level. You might look at one species that has a role in different areas. Okay, that's a reductionist type of thought process. There's also the reverse of that is the holistic, referring to a big picture mentality in which a person recognizes the interconnectedness of various elements that form larger systems, patterns, and objects. So now we're going to the big picture scale where you're looking at systems and how do different parts work in these systems. So the question is, can you do both? And that's something that I've wrestled with for many years. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some of the time points in my career about where I think my thought process has crystallized on different areas. Okay, so I'm going to go back to graduate school. This is University of California, Davis. As Tony mentioned, I have a PhD in soil and biogeochemistry. And everyone has that one course. Maybe you have more than one course. But you have the one course that really challenges you, makes you think, engages you in some way. So I had that one course. Now I had multiple courses, but this course was Soil Science 105. And this is a field course in the summer. It was 3 weeks, well, actually more than 3 weeks, but we went out all over California. And if you know anything about California, it actually has all 12 soil orders in the state. So we were able to see all 12 of these on this tour. And so you can see, whether we were up in the mountains in the snow, whether we were out in the desert, whether we were in a pit in the forest areas. So here I am, I don't know if I'm meditating or taking notes. Here is definitely a meditated shot. But we're on some pretty high elevation. And this group, you really kind of coalesce as a group, and you really start to exchange ideas, thoughts, not just during this kind of field presentation time, And so the motto was no whining, adventure, and always move forward. Okay, so here's why you should take the class, and I think every good professor has a reason why you should take the course. So here was the description, and really what I highlight is we can never duplicate what you will see and learn in the field. So their thrust was you need to get out and experience it. Okay, so did I do it once? No, I did it twice because I just couldn't get enough. Okay, so that's the first time point that I think I really was now challenged in my thinking. Okay, so let's move forward to, as Tony mentioned, I did a postdoc at Washington State University. And here's where kind of the outside the box thinking really started to materialize, where I was working at a Center for Precision Agricultural and Automated Systems. So completely different from my graduate school training. This is where engineers get together and they create these machines that do all kinds of wild stuff, okay? So I thought, well, how do we apply that to weeds and weed management? Well, our traditional approach is a combination of the various methods. And now that we have technology, and I'm not talking about biotechnology, but technology, sensors, automation, now we can think about removing the spatial temporal constraints and combining the biology with the technology. So I've written a paper, I got many different authors together, and we wrote a book on this topic about the future weed control and cropping systems. Okay, so this was another kind of galvanizing period where, okay, now this is another thought process. So then I went to University of Nebraska, assistant professor, a lot of energy, a lot of enthusiasm. Was really excited about getting a program going, and I heard about the NSF career program. And that to me was a golden opportunity, at least what I thought, to really put forward an idea and take it to a level of adding the theory and the things that I thought were really valuable in looking at invasive plants, the ecology, the evolution, and that kind of thing. So I looked into this program. I'm sure everyone knows about it. And so I should also say at that same time, I was working on invasive plants out in the environment. And in 2012, Nebraska was in one of these highlighted colors where extreme or exceptional drought was occurring. Okay, so I was thinking about that. I was thinking about invasive plants, the environment. Okay, how are these things kind of working together? Went ahead and submitted a proposal looking at invasive plant species response to extreme weather events. And this is just a little snapshot, the intellectual merit part of it. What were we doing? We were looking at phenotypic characterization and genetic markers associated with plant growth and reproduction, invasives versus natives. And looking at this R-star model that was first proposed by Tillman, where the most competitive species is the one with the lowest resource requirement. And we wanted to develop greater understanding of how native and invasive plant species differ in their adaptation in these new and existing environments, especially where drought was occurring. So really excited about this. I went to 2 grant writing workshops, talked to the people, said, you know, is this right? Am I on track? Got a lot of reviews on it. Came a little roadblock here. Do not fund, all right? Everyone's had that. So there was nothing fundamentally wrong. It was just, you know, you got to be exceptional of the exception, I should say outstanding, okay? So who cares? Just keep going with this. So regardless, I have looked at a lot of different proposals. This is just a list which any faculty member, I'm sure, has the same list or longer. It's interesting, I was talking to a colleague who's now at administrative level, and he said, you know, I've still got boxes of proposals back in the day when you had to actually write and you know, send it in by paper. So this is just showing you that the thought process hadn't stopped. Even though I didn't get funded, even though it was kind of a letdown, the thought process didn't quit, okay? So here we are. This, everyone, for those of you coffee aficionados, you know, here's the percolating coffee pot. Okay, this is my brain, a pot of coffee, and it's percolating over the stove with all these ideas. You know, I've been exposed to starting graduate school. You know, everything's going, and I'm wondering are we going to get to this nice cup of coffee? Well, well, the jury's still out on that. I haven't reached that point. But hopefully, with what you see today, maybe we're getting towards this point. Okay, so let's go back to the. So let's now move into the where we're looking at this framework and looking at what are the key research papers. Okay, so I'm going to hit on 3 papers. There's multiple papers out there on invasion biology, but I'm going to focus on 3 that I think really are applicable to what I was trying to do and now what I've been working with my colleagues, Tony and David. Okay, so looking at this paper by Peter Albert at UMass on invasiveness, invasibility, and the role of environmental stress in the spread of non-native plants. Okay, so what they were looking at was invasiveness of the species versus invasibility of the habitat. And it's really challenging to identify traits of invasive plants because they're different. They do different things in different environments. The habitat type is a little bit, I wouldn't say easier, but more realistic in how do we quantify it. So they're looking at factors, and they identified competition intensity, disturbance regimes, environmental stress. And I'm not going to go into a lot of this, but just highlight the thing that they focused on was the environmental stress and invasibility. So here's just a little diagram. This is their conceptual model. The difference between these two is this is cases in which high stress should decrease invasibility, and this is where cases of high stress should increase invasibility. And this is just conceptual. This is what they were thinking. It's not based on empirical studies. So looking at case 1, here we are, high stress will kill the non-native. Case 2, the non-natives are competitively inferior at maximum stress levels. And then case 3, the non-natives are slightly competitive at slightly more superior at high stress levels. Looking at the other where we have increased invasibility, case 1 is non-natives are competitively inferior at low stress, so where there's low stress, and then the case 5, non-natives are competitively superior at all stress levels. Okay, so we've got that there. Next, I'm going to jump to this paper by Facone et al., and they were looking at invasion success affected by factors. Okay, so you're hearing this factor term. I want you to remember that because we're going to hit on that again. So looking at their focus was this migration factor. When does something invade, or when does it first come into the community, and then what happens? And so looking at ecological and evolutionary changes. So they came up with some invasion scenarios showing how the factors contributed to invader and habitat match. And here's a diagram from their paper, and I'll just walk you through this a little bit. Here's on the x-axis here, y-axis, characteristics of the invaded areas and of the invasive species. On the x-axis we have time, and the invaded area, that's this dotted line. The invasive species is the solid line. The migration, so when it's introduced, is the arrow. And then when the invasion process starts is the vertical line on the time axis. So they have 4 scenarios. This first one is only a change in the migration regime is needed to initiate invasion. So that's pretty simple. Invasion begins after change in the invaded area. Okay, so if we look at the invaded area, something's going on. And then at this point, the invasion process actually starts. If you flip that around, looking at the invader, now there's something going on here, and then at this point, the invasion actually starts. And then finally, at the scenario D, where they had a change in migration and invaded area, needed to initiate the invasion. And so they talk about several examples about where this could occur. Okay, so the last paper is one by Jessica Gurvich at Stony Brook, and she and her colleagues are looking at kind of synthesizing where we are with biological invasion. So kind of this big picture look at things. And so they came up with this conceptual synthetic invasion meta framework. Real tongue twister, but they just simplify it to SIM, where the unifying principles of ecology and in evolutionary biology. And really what they were trying to focus on was this demography of invasions, where they occur, and then looking at these three characteristics. And I'm going to touch on this a little bit because those are kind of fundamental for our framework, where it's looking at rapid local population increase, monocultures or local dominance, and range expansion. And so they looked at the literature, kind of summarized the different models that were out there, and they came up with their model to help kind of push us along with quantifying and testing the evaluation of these causal factors. So here's a picture cartoon of their figure where they've shown that the sim can be applied to this simple case of enemy escape. It's in this invasion theory where the invader demography then relates to this population interactions, and going through this affects these different invasion components. You flip it around a little bit where it's applied now to the example of ecological and evolutionary components. And this is related to propagule pressure. And here we have basically looking at human impacts and how they're related to this process, which relates to invader demography, and then again affecting these two different components. And then finally, this is where they apply it to the evolution of increased competitive ability, where that theory is the invasive plant is released from its constraints in the new environment. And so they apply their model to how this scenario might work out and how it would affect, again, this rapid population increase and the dominant monoculture. Okay, so like I said, those are 3 papers. There's several others. And these are just some examples of really some kind of primary or really key papers that have been published on this kind of modeling, looking at how do we understand the theory of invasibility, whether this paper by Davis, Catford et al. Did a nice study on looking at invasion ecology and a theoretical framework. I just want to point out this one by Ibanez, really a nice paper integrating assessment of biological invasion, so not just plants, but really looking across the wider context. So these are papers that could be looked at as well. But now I want to talk a little bit about what we did as far as developing our framework. So you're kind of getting used to this paper thing. Okay, so Kohler and Lodge is a paper that talks about looking at the establishment, so invasive plants established in going through this kind of scenario. And it's important to understand that a lot of invasive plants, they might be introduced, but they don't always establish. And so what they did was kind of describe this in a way of where these points of failure could be. So a species that's entrained in the transport pathway, whether it's brought over an ocean, whether it's transported across a region, oftentimes there's a failure in the transport. Okay, if it survives the transport and introduction, it fails to establish. Maybe the conditions aren't right. Maybe it's competitive. Maybe there's a disturbance factor that's limiting that ability. When it does establish, sometimes it still remains non-invasive. You can see weeds, invasive plants that do establish, but they're not a problem. They don't reach this final stage where they're spreading, and that's where they become invasive. And I think I've read a report. The kind of the ballpark is 10% of plants actually become invasive. So the ones that we have, that's 10% of all the ones that have been introduced. Okay, so that's this kind of structure. But then for what we were looking at, again, I'm going to go back to the components that Gurevich et al. Talked about, because we really focused on this framework in the context of these 3 components. So rapid population increase, And this is where populations increase exponentially. So whether that's at a single, starting from a single plant or multiple plants, there's this rapid increase. And also an established local dominance. So where there's monocultures that are created with limited or no diversity, and that can occur at, again, scales of small, local to large. But then we get to range expansion where there's a dispersal from local populations occurring in these transition or disturbance zones. Okay, so that's kind of this invasion process. Now, these stages don't always occur chronologically. They might occur simultaneously, but typically that's the process. So those are the stages that are included. Okay, so next, the goal that we had was really we're not trying to predict how and where invasions will occur, which a lot of models do, but instead we were using these three main factors of resident community, the invader fitness, and weather to guide and develop our understanding of why invasions occur. So these three main factors that we've kind of included in our framework is the resident community. So what are some things that are part of the resident community? Obviously there's other plants. There are the micro and macro fauna. There's nutrients, soil type. There's a lot of different parts of the resident community that are factoring into the invasion process. And again, this is probably simplified to some degree, but it's a starting point of where we're going. Invader fitness. So how does the invasive species respond? What are the things such as the plasticity of the plant? Whether it's able to adapt. What is the genetic selection of the plants that are there? How are they fit to adapt to those the new environment or the new habitat that they're introduced to? And then finally, the weather factor. That has been really important, especially as we see these new extreme conditions occur, but not just extreme highs and lows, also the normal conditions. 30-year averages, not just averages, but frequency and duration. How frequent are these events occurring? What is the duration? And of course, the effects of different, in this case, CO2 concentrations, but even other gases, other weather-related factors. Okay, so we've got factors. We've got this kind of invasion framework where we've got these components. The factors are contributing to the components. So now what we were going to do, now what we did was we went to the literature and looked for empirical research that would help us to build our conceptual model to show exactly how resident community, invader fitness, and weather influence the invasion process. Okay, so we identified 3 invasive plant species, and we chose these based on their known, kind of well-known, where they're distributed across the regions or across the country, at least as far as in this country. And then we looked at the number of published empirical studies for each of the factors. And so these are the number of papers that were identified. Again, these are empirical studies with data that we could use to evaluate as far as their contribution to these different factors and ultimately to this invasion factor framework. So we chose yellow star thistle, non-native common reed, musk thistle. I actually also have worked with these plant species, so there's a little bit of a bias there. But the point is we've identified these species, and what we hope to do when we get done is you could substitute any invasive plant species and run that through this model to see what the outcome is. Okay, so just an example. This is just the top line of one of the tables, and this is for yellow star thistle. So here's the reference paper by Brown and Rice in 2010, and here are the resident community factor, the 4 things that we've kind of grouped these into as far as did this paper address one of these subcategories in the factors. And we also looked for if there were other things related to resident plant community in this, in addition to these other 4. And then what we did was assess what was the invasion component that was affected. So there was 3 components, and we tried to quantify, was it most affecting the rapid population increase, local dominance, or range expansion? So for this paper, we were able to assess it as rapid population increase. Okay, so looking at Phragmites, same thing, resident community. Oh, and I should also note, the remaining papers were categorized into this table, as well as the 2 others, invader fitness and weather. So we had a total of 9 tables that we categorized the papers. I'm not going to show all those tables right now because it would put you to sleep, and I want to just get through this a little bit quicker. So here's a paper by Song et al. Again, these were the summarizing what were the things that they looked at under these different categories. And then here's where we assessed what was the invasion component affected. And then finally for musk thistle, actually a lot of work has been done on musk thistle by a person at Penn State. Really done a nice job of looking at all the different factors of musk thistle. This is an example of some of her work with a graduate student looking at simulated grazing. Then they also look at pasture grasses in old fields and how there was competition. And we assess that as establishing local dominance. Okay? So, looking at our tables, we then took this information from the invasion component that was affected, and we used it in this conceptual model. Okay, so so now we're going to go to looking at how we're testing this conceptual model. And we wanted to summarize the empirical studies on our 3 example invasive plant species to contextualize our invasion factor framework. So we're using this, what was the invasion component affected from the category, and putting it into this model. So here's our figure, and this is, again, this is looking at the influence of the component in limiting the invasion success. So here's just one. This is the weather factor. And here's for our 3 species, musk thistle, Phragmites, and yellow star thistle. And then along the x-axis, we have rapid population increase, increased local dominance, rapid range expansion, and that's from our framework. So these are the components of invasion success. And from what we can see, this is very kind of generalized, but looking at our example invasive species, extreme weather, in this case, limits invasion success primarily by affecting the rapid range expansion component. So out here, we see that this was most limiting to these 3 species. Now we can say different things about this established local dominance and rapid population increase because obviously, you know, they're not all at the same level, and star thistle was affected across all the different components of the invasion process. But what's really interesting is the current predictive models would suggest otherwise. So what we've seen, what we summarized empirically from empirical studies doesn't necessarily match up with what's being predicted. And I think that's one of the interesting things that we found out with this, and that's for this weather factor. But like I said, I'm not going to go through all the different figures right now. I just want to kind of bring this back and show where we're at with this by looking at these recent conceptual models, broadly synthesize concepts and theory to test hypotheses, improve understanding, and identify research directions. So that's kind of the big picture. While the reductionist approach is focused on things like fluctuating resource availability, invader and resident community, introduce native ranges, and then these current and future climate conditions. So our invasion factor framework combines the factors affecting the invasion process and synthesizes it into a framework. So we're trying to bring both of these together to better understand for a particular invasive species why that's been occurring. Okay, so I'm going to jump really quickly in here to future directions and talking about, so I've thought back to my thought process that I kind of introduced earlier. So how would this guide research? You know, if I was to be focused on research, what would this do for a research program? Well, if a person was looking at individual invasive plant species, are there enough empirical studies on the factor to be able to make an assessment of it? And for some species, maybe there are adequate number of empirical studies. Maybe it's just been studied to death, but the lack of synthesis. Maybe it's not been synthesized to say, this is where this weakness is, or this is where has been a real critical area that we have now been able to understand with the research that's available. Also, an approach for targeting specific management. If you know something specific, maybe it's a resident plant community effect, maybe it's an invader fitness, maybe it's something to do with weather, can you target management to really address that area? And then also, the thing that's really fun is to address invasion theories and really push that to see, you know, where are we going to go with this thought process. So as I kind of alluded to, this model congruence, where we've got this empirically based conceptual models, and then we've got data-driven projection models. And Bethany Bradley at University of Massachusetts has done a lot of work on kind of predicting different scenarios, different situations with invasive plants. But can we bring these two together with either companion studies, verification tools, some way to say the projection is actually reflecting what the empirical research is showing? And that's where I want to end with this. This is a quote from their paper in 2009. The uncertainties associated with changes in climate, vegetation communities, and the response of invasive plant species warrant an urgent need for integrating modeling and experimental work to better address the ecological ramifications. So I think that really, in a way, summarizes, at least for this weather factor. Now, we've got a lot of other things that, you know, we can say maybe similar things, but you know, can we bring those two together to really move this along? So with that, I'd like to thank my co-authors, again, Tony DiTomaso and David Clements, Department of Biology at Trinity Western University. And if there's any questions, thoughts, comments, I think we have some time for it. So, yeah.
Great.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.